My name is Hillary Rink. I am interviewing Lorraine Fontana. Today is Monday, October 29th, 2012. We are in the Archives Library at Georgia State University. And first of all, Lorraine, I would like to get you to give us your full name, how old you are, your date of birth, and where you were born.
Okay, Lorraine Fontana. I was born April 13, 1947, so I'm 65 years old at this point.
Yes, and you were born where?
In New York City, in Queens, Astoria, Queens.
Okay. Can you, this is going to run probably over the course of 2 interviews, so we're going to take things somewhat chronologically. It's sort of the first area of focus I'd like to talk about is get a little bit of information on your family and on your family's background and how long they had been in the New York area and what ethnic background they came from, et cetera, just to help provide context for your life.
Okay. Well, my grandparents, both sets of grandparents, were immigrants from Italy. My mother's family's from Sicily, and my father's family's from Modena, which is like north central Italy. And most of the children in both families were born in Italy, but some were born here. My mother and my father and their families were youngest kids. They were among the youngest, and they were born here in the United States. But of course, everyone spoke Italian when they were growing up. My father actually went back to Italy with his father and went to elementary school, you would call it, over there. A lot of the kids went back. My grandfather, turns out, did 13 trips, I was told, back and forth to Italy, and couldn't bring up all the kids at one time, kind of thing. He had 11 kids in his family, my father's family, and 7 in my mother's. So anyway, so we were Italian, and we lived in Astoria, which was at that time and still is pretty heavily Catholic, although there's a lot of Greek folks there also. So there were Italian and Irish and Polish, and there's that kind of ethnic white ethnic community, working class. And both my parents worked.
What did they do?
My father had a million jobs over his life, kind of like I ended up. Went from one thing to another. So they were all kind of working class kind of jobs, from working in factory to driving a truck to, and he worked at the post office for a while, delivering mail. And then when he ended up, he was a cab driver for a while. He was a taxi driver, cabbie. And where he ended up was in working for the Transit Authority in New York. Started out by working on a cleaning crew in the subway, cleaning the subways at night, and then worked his way into being a token guy. He would sell the tokens when that was what they used back then. And that's what I remember him doing mostly. And a lot of the times he would be working at night. He'd come home after I went to school in the morning. He'd be asleep sometimes when I came home. So he worked at night a lot. And my mother, luckily, women at that time, girls, would go into either commercial class in high school, and learn typing and secretarial. That's what she did. She was a typist. She always had that kind of a job. In fact, I think her title was typist rather than secretary. And she worked in different places. She even worked in factory at one time, but she ended up getting a white-collar type job, typing. And she ended up working with the American Booksellers Association.
And did you have siblings?
I have one brother who's 4 years older, Richard Allen Fontana. I always called him Richie. And he still lives in New York. He still lives in Astoria, in Long Island City. Yeah.
So, were your parents relatively young when they had you and your brother as children, or relatively old? Or
I'd have to figure out all the years and all that again. My mother was born in my father was born in 1912, and she was born in 1916, I guess.
So,
or is it? It's
30s.
something. She was born in 1919. My father was born in 1915. Okay. And since I was born in 47, I'm trying to think of how old they were. My brother was born not long after they got married. I said I could figure it out. 91, they had their 50th wedding anniversary. So 41 they were married, and he was born in 43.
Okay.
And I was born in 47.
Okay. So talk to me a little bit about your childhood, where you went to school. Did you spend your entire childhood in the same neighborhood of Astoria growing up, or did you live in other parts
Actually,
of
I don't have memories of the really early childhood. It's funny, a lot of people I've spoken to can remember way back when they were 2 and 3 years old, but the earliest memories I have was I was early in elementary school.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the one memory I have before elementary school is I remember getting my tonsils out, and that was before I went to school. So the memories I have are from 25th Street, Crescent Street in Astoria, and I lived there until we didn't move from there until I was in high school, and we didn't move that far. We were still in Astoria, so it was the same general. It wasn't that far when we moved, and it was I was in PS 122, which is right near the East River in Astoria, near the Hell Gates and Triborough Bridges, near Astoria Park, and that's what I remember most as a kid growing up in that neighborhood, and there was. Because there was a lot of churches around, and I remember we lived between a few blocks this way was the school, and a few blocks the other way was the church we went to. So, it was real close in walking distance.
What type of role did the church play in your life as a child? Was it a big part of your life? Did you go a lot? Did you not?
Interesting. Our whole family, of course, was Catholic, and some of my cousins, their parents really did go to get the mass themselves and were involved in that way, and a few of them even went to Catholic school, but not us, because my parents never went to mass, at least that I remember. They had already, for different reasons, I think, kind of put that aside. Now my grandmother was very, you go to church, and some of my aunts and uncles. So what it was a cultural thing more than anything else. In other words, this is what you do. We're an Italian family, and First Communion's a big thing, your confirmation's a big thing, and I have pictures. I remember, everyone being all dressed up because I made my First Communion, and my cousin Reed was making it at the same time. So, and they still lived in Astoria too. So we have all these pictures of us, all dressed up. And confirmation was a similar thing, and I didn't drop out of considering myself Catholic until after confirmation when I was a teenager. So it was, I went to Mass every Sunday, did the usual things. There were things like I called them cultural because they weren't related really to a spiritual path, I don't think. I didn't get that from my parents, a very religious kind of, it was that you had to do this, you had to go to catechism because you went to public school, you got released early, 1 day a week to go to the church and learn the catechism, but it was more like a social thing for me. You get to meet other kids. You knew other kids in the neighborhood that way. And
talk about a little bit some of your memories of elementary school. What types of things come to mind?
Interesting. It was a very. I'm trying to remember if there were any students of color at all. And I don't remember, it was almost all white. And that changed when I went to junior high and then to other schools when I moved, because we were closer to areas where there were Latino and black communities. But I guess our community was pretty white, and I remember always liking school, being a very good student. I really liked, the school. I think from very early on, I wore glasses very early on, could hardly see anything, and how kids are, so 4 eyes, and and I think I never really felt very comfortable being who I was supposed to be, and so being good at school was a plus. That carried all the way through, I think. This is one thing I could be good at, so nobody can make fun of me about this, that kind of feeling. And I remember Mrs. Pollock. I remember the one teacher. I remember Mrs. Pollock, because she was always encouraging me. I loved to read. I was, read. And she gave me a present once of this really oversized cloth edition of Alice in Wonderland. which I don't know what happened to it. I wish I still had it, but it was like I remember that book, and getting it from it was like a big treat. So that's what I remember. I know that I was a tomboy when I was growing up. I loved, and my mother did too, by the way. I found out later. And she loved sports. She loved running around. She was like a tomboy too, or she wouldn't use that word. So I would, my main thing was, besides school, was being able to play after school and do all the, We lived on in apartments all along Crescent Street, and it was a hill. And I don't know how we did it, because it was on the hill, but we'd go in the street and play stickball in the street, even on the hill. And in the winter, of course, when it snowed, we'd be able, there was an alleyway down the back of it, and we sled down, the hill. So the neighborhood and playing right around, either running races around the buildings, or playing stickball, or we call it Ace King Queen. It was a ball game we played against the building, stuff like that. And I remember being very, loving to be a cowboy with it. Anyway, that's the kind of what I remember is playing with kids in the neighborhood. And my brother, being 4 years older, always wanted me to get away from him. His younger says he didn't want me hanging around. And there were lots of kids in this neighborhood. So we just had all different kids of different ages, to become like a family with and play with. And I had some cousins who lived not far away, so that I remember a lot of the pictures where, cousins are over. Sunday would be my grandma, Vasali, my mother's mother, lived right downstairs from us in the same building. And she would have some of her sons, and my father would go too, over to play pinochle. And that was after Mass. Then you'd come and you'd go to Grandma's, because that's would be playing pinochle, and we'd play games, the kids that showed up. So that was, and having my grandmother there, by the way, was a big thing about growing up, because they had my parents were working, but then after school, that's who was there, and that's who I'd go to.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the school being a place where you felt like you could excel. You said you felt a little different, maybe because of the glasses. You felt you were a tomboy. You liked sports, etc. Did you get any feedback or any? Do you feel that any of your friends noticed? Did you feel any different by being a girl and wanting to do sports?
I didn't feel anything like that.
Okay.
No, I mean, no. All I can say is no. I'm trying to think if there was anything. I don't remember anything like that. Okay. It's funny because I look back and I go, it must have been at some point. My mother, of course, started really encouraging me, like she did when she hit a certain age, in adolescence, to look. She would never say look more feminine, but it would be clear you have to look like a girl, look like you wear a certain way. And by the way, and even at that point in school, even when I started college, there was still a dress code where girls wore skirts and dresses. You didn't wear pants. So it wasn't like I didn't wear dresses, but when I was going out to play, I could wear pants and stuff, and that's what I was most comfortable in. I look at pictures of myself. This is very interesting, and I can see my discomfort in certain pictures. And I would, like, for graduation, I'd have my whatever dress on, or I'd be in my brother's wedding as a bridesmaid, and I'd have to be all dressed up, and it wouldn't look like me because my hair would be fixed, and I would never usually fix it like that, and I had makeup and all that. And my mother, of course, would want me pluck my eyebrows, wear makeup. What's the matter with you? And I hated that stuff. But I did that for her. Wore stockings, that kind of stuff. And I wasn't comfortable doing that. I could look at pictures of me with my friends in high school, for instance, who all seemed to be much more attractive and much more, and had boyfriends and everything. And there I was at a sweet 16 birthday party for me that I had my friends over, and I looked really, I looked kind of dumpy and very, not attractive, and I think I was not comfortable. Then I see a picture of myself, younger age, but when I went to the Catskill game farms with my parents, and there's a picture of me kneeling next to a deer and petting the deer. And I'm in, just kind of my dungarees and I look so comfortable. And so it's like, now I look at myself now, I wonder whether anybody in my family ever had any sense of, because my mother was a tomboy, like I said, and athletics was, so you liked athletics, you liked to run around, you liked to be on a bicycle, or that wasn't something that made you different necessarily. Yeah. Except when you got older, and then I talked to my mom about this when she was in a nursing home, and I tried to get a sense of when because she was good because she loved gym, she loved physical education, it was her best subject, she said, her favorite subject. And when she stopped doing that, well, when it became inappropriate for her to play with boys anymore, you couldn't play with boys, and you weren't supposed to be doing that stuff. So she said, okay, she didn't do that anymore, but with me, I just did it as long as I. So.
How did that? So my sense is that would have been easier for you in elementary school. Talk a little bit now about high school and your movement into high school, and did that comfort with the sports and all that continue, and did that cause any different issues in high school than elementary?
I don't remember anything different about high school. I really don't. I don't have very clear memories of high school in terms of like gym classes and how that was different. And I know I was so short and never really grew very tall, so I love basketball, but you could only do that so long if you were really going to play against other women who really could play better because they were taller. So, and even in college I liked to do stuff like that, but I really realized because of both height and what I could do physically and where I was in terms of my appearance that maybe the brain stuff would be where I'd work hard. I had to work hard to get good grades. It wasn't like an easy thing. It didn't come like naturally, but I did work hard. So that's what I remember from school. And high school was a little different because it was a target, one of these target schools. I didn't go to high school right in my neighborhood. I would have gone to what was a very tough, rough high school, working class area and kids. And my junior high was kind of like that. There were Latino kids, black kids, and white kids, and there were gangs. And those three groups kind of stayed separated and tend to fight each other. And that high school was going to be very similar to that. But I went to Newtown, which was a little further into Queens, because they had these special majors, and so art was something that I was really into. And I got accepted to being an art major. And so my people in my home room were all these other art majors, right? And so that's who I hung around with, and that's who I got to know. And we had a little informal sorority. We didn't call it that, but it was kind of,
Was this co-ed?
Yeah.
And when you said you liked art, what particular, was it painting or sculpture?
I used to draw when I was a kid all the time, and everyone always said, "Oh, that's great." I'd copy everything, and it would be so good, So I had some talent in art, and so that was being encouraged. And I didn't continue with that because I ran into the other kids who were really talented. I mean, they were really good, and they were going to become fine artists. I could have done commercial art, maybe. I could have gone into that. And I did some stuff at my parents' saved stuff that I did. That's some of the stuff that I found. It's like, what? I have an unfinished painting of the Beatles, which
wow.
which they saved. Anyway, I really I enjoyed it, and I would have gone on if I had more confidence that I had the talent, but I didn't feel I did. And at the same time, I got to go into what they call the SP classes for academic stuff. My brother, my parents wanted him to go on to college. It would have been the first person, to be able to go to college in the family. But they didn't ever say to me, "We want you to go to." It wasn't like, it was funny. I think about it now and I go, it's just the sexism stuff. It's like he was expected to do something, but when I said I wanted to, oh, that's great, but you don't have to. Why would you want to? It's kind of interesting. Turned out he got a scholarship but didn't go to college, decided not to, because none of his friends were. And I got a Regents scholarship, and I ended up going to a city university. But anyway, in high school, I took kind of academic classes that would prepare you, instead of going to, like some of the art majors would also just have other classes which were called commercial or more. So it depended on kind of what your grades were in the pre-V and junior high and what they thought you could do. And and biology I love biology, and I got a biology medal when I graduated, so that's what I decided to be a major in. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was like, so art, no, I'm not good enough for that. I'll try biology because that sounds good.
And you graduated high school what year?
64.
64. So you said the one of the focuses or the focus of the high school was art. Did you have any sense while you were there that any of your classmates were gay or lesbian?
I didn't have any sense of sexual orientation stuff at all until much later. So why? Well, I wasn't a stupid person, It wasn't that I had ever not heard negative things. You hear anything, you heard negative things about gay people, queer people, but I could look back now and I can go, oh, Anthony Sansato, oh my God, of course he was queer. But then I had no sense of that. I had no sense of that anybody might not be girlfriend and boyfriend, and that's what there was.
Do you remember any feelings within yourself of attraction to women?
No, that whole story is another interesting thing. And it wasn't that I ever thought, oh, I think I must be a lesbian or gay or homosexual. I never thought that. And yet, my attractions were often to women. And on TV, there would be the actresses I would really be attracted to, Now, there were some actors, too, that I was really attracted to. And those are the ones I would, talk about with my parents and stuff. And I remember that a lot of times my dreams would, be a romantic thing about women. I'd be the man in the dream, and there would be, this actress or this woman. So, that stuff happened a lot. And when you think about it later on, you go, what did you do with that? What were you... And I was like, it was denial. Whatever that psychological thing is you just, you go, okay, well... It was strange. It was very strange. And I would... to other people, I was like really into George Maharis. I loved him as an actor, and I would draw pictures of him and stuff. So they, oh, look, she likes, she's attracted to these men. Now they knew I didn't have any boyfriends. I didn't go on dates. In college, I had one date, total of one date. 4 years I was in college. With a guy. I remember him now as somebody was kind of a beatnik-looking guy, maybe kind of progressive politics. I don't remember much about him, except that's what I remember he looked like, and so I felt kind of comfortable with him.
How did the date come about? Do you remember?
I don't remember. He asked me, and I don't even remember what it was. I don't remember where we went. It was no big thing. In fact, it was like, they'll probably thank God that it's over kind of feeling. So it was kind of weird. I'd be interested in going back if I ever could contact any of my high school buddies to find out if they had any sense that what's with Lorraine? I don't know. That'd be interesting to find out. If telling them now I came out, and would they be surprised? Would they say, "Oh, of course," or something? I have no sense.
Do you think a lot of that was due to the time period?
Yeah.
That you were in? It would have been different if it had been 20 years later.
Oh yeah. Oh definitely. Oh definitely. And I also don't remember, by the way, really anti-gay stuff. Like I don't remember like anybody being picked on like. They call that person. I don't remember that stuff. I'm sure that happened because that's how kids are. But I don't remember that happening. Could be I blocked it out too. I don't know. But
so now, where did you go? You said you went to college in New York City.
Yeah, Queens College. It's part of the City University in New York.
Okay.
Queens College.
And you said biology major.
That's what I started as, until I hit organic chemistry, and that changed that. I dropped out. It was early enough where I realized that, oh my God, I don't know what chemistry was bad enough, but organic chemistry really got me. So then I decided, what am I going to do? At one point, I thought art history. Get back in. I mean, I could do it myself. Art history, I would love that. And the only thing that stopped me there, this is showing some academic weaknesses, is I'd have to take another language like Russian or. It was either Russian or, because I knew Italian. Italian is what I took in school because my parents never taught me Italian. So I thought I should take Italian. So I learned Italian. But then Russian or, it was another language. It wasn't going to be an easy language for me if I was going to be an art major. And I was so bad at language. Even Italian I struggled with when we got to, the more advanced stages and old Italian and all that. So I said, oh, I can't do that. So I took, like what seemed an easiest thing to do is kind of into sciences, but not. By the way, let me tell you, when I went into biology, think now of women who were really good in biology, what they might think of doing, right? You know what I thought of doing? Being a lab technician. That's what I was going to do because I was going to be a biology major. I didn't think medicine, preschool, pre-medical school. Why? I think it's because it was in the middle of the 60s and I was a girl, and women don't do that kind of... I mean, I'm shocked at it now to say that, but yeah, it wasn't even in my head that I could do something like go to medical school. And when my parents saw me get the medal, they never suggested anything like that. So it's shocking now to think of that.
Yeah.
But anyway, organic chemistry I wouldn't have done good in any kind of pre-med either. So psychology is where I ended up. And I think it's an indictment of the school system where they don't really get to know each kid enough, there's so many kids, to see what they really might be interested in. The last semester I had to take electives at the end, and I took an anthropology class, and I said, wow, if I had taken this very early, I would have been interested in anthropology. And that's where I might have ended up going. But I was in psychology. I graduated with a psychology degree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, upon graduating from college, what was your next move? Did you stay in New York? Did you go elsewhere?
No. I decided to go. I'm becoming very socially justice oriented during college, especially. I mean, especially in high school, even not actually in activism, but in my opinions, in my analysis of what was happening in the world and in the country because of the civil rights movement. And so in college I started doing a little, it's a student help project it was called, and it was just to do an activity that would help somebody else, which meant the disadvantaged kids who we want to help learn to read so they could get into college. So I did a thing, we were tutoring kids, and that's what I did. And I was, I began to be anti-war during that time. So the politics were starting to be very progressive based on race and class issues and who I would support, when I got to where I could vote and all that kind of stuff. So when I graduated, I just didn't want to go right to graduate school or anything. I wanted to do something meaningful, and the Peace Corps was one opportunity. But then there was what they call the domestic Peace Corps, which is VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. This was the early version of VISTA. And so I decided, I wanted to do that. And I applied and got accepted, and they sent me to Atlanta, Georgia, to the South. And my parents were all like, oh my God, because you have to understand, a lot of stuff had already happened in the South, but things were still really happening, and kind of
What year would this have been?
I'm sorry?
What year would this have been?
68. 68. Number one, Kennedy was killed the last year I was in high school, and Martin Luther King was assassinated the last year I was in Queens, and Andrew Goodman, one of the three, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, that got killed and were found dead in the swamps. Goodman was a Queens College student, and that was just that year. And then Martin Luther King was killed, and then they find out I'm being sent to Atlanta, Georgia, and that's where I'm going to work. And it was like, I said, no, don't worry about it. It's going to be great. And it was community organizing stuff, and it was very general. Now, VISTA has changed a lot. To become a VISTA, you have to have some kind of skills or experience or talent, very specific, that you're going to apply to a situation. Back then, it's like, oh, you want to be in VISTA? You coming from college? Great, come on down, and here, go into the neighborhood and organize. It was that general. It was like, and so I worked here in Atlanta, and that's where I learned to love Atlanta. I really loved Atlanta, the city, the people, and I ended up working in West End and living in West End, and I worked with Harris Homes, which was public housing project in West End, and the area block clubs. At that time, there was the War on Poverty, which VISTA was part of that, and the CAP agency here was Economic Opportunity Atlanta, EOA, and they had area block clubs. So the area block clubs in West End, I got involved through the center with the people that work with them, so I did work kind of with them and directly with the community.
And can you describe area block clubs? I'm not familiar with that.
It's like, they have NPUs now. This is kind of like that idea. So it was a particular geographical area, and they would try to get as many people who lived in the area to come to meetings to talk about what did they want to happen in the neighborhood. And in this case, it was about economic development, and it was always the poorer areas, So yeah, people would get involved in that and would either there would be fundraisers, there would be maybe some activities. What Vistas and my cycle ended up getting into and doing was we all decided to form buying clubs in our neighborhoods. And the idea was to have buying clubs and then maybe get them all together into a buying cooperative. And that happened. So I think that was the one concrete thing that I think maybe was that I actually added. Otherwise, I got much more out of it than anybody in Harris Homes or the people in the neighborhoods,
And what were the buying clubs for? What were you buying?
Food. It was food buying clubs, yeah. So, like as we formed one, we would go down to the farmer's market down in College Park or some open farmer's market down there, and get produce in bulk, and that was most of what we got. And then sometimes we'd go to, I think it was the Enterman's warehouse. It was the people that did A&P, I think. I'm not forget what chain it was, but they would sell wholesale to us also. So it was a matter of, there was a lot of organizing to get people who's interested. How do you collect the orders from everybody? Who collates them? Who goes and gets the food? Where do we distribute it from? So it was all that kind of stuff. And that was pretty successful for people who were in it. It was a very good way for those people to save money on. And we formed eventually what was called the Atlanta Cooperative Food Project, ACFP, which was the Seawide Co-op, and we rented a warehouse space downtown, where then all the food that we got went to there, and that's where people came from the clubs and got their stuff. That's how it was distributed.
How long did that stay in existence?
I'm not sure. I know that I ended up going back to New York for a few months. When I stayed longer than a year. I was going to stay a second year in Vista, and long story short about why not, I ended up not staying and ended up in January of, so it was 68, 69, January of 70 going back to New York, and then coming back here to graduate school in the summer so I could start in the fall to graduate school here. And at that time, I think it was still existing and functioning, because I remember I ended up living in Little Five Points area. First I ended up living in Midtown, but then when I ended up in Little Five Points, there was a buying club there that was still functioning, and it was part of that system. And eventually, it and some other groups formed Sevenanda out of that, and that's how Sevenanda started.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so... so it lasted for a while, and to tell you the truth, when I went back there, I didn't stay in touch with people. Probably was an emotional thing with me. I was just really detaching because of things that had happened here, and I was just trying to get away. Other people would know more about it. John Sweet might even know more about it. John Sweet was the Vista with me in that cycle. He later became a city councilman. He's an attorney. He was very key in ACFP in helping form it, and stayed with it, I think, because I moved away and he didn't. So I bet I would like to talk with him and see if he remembers, how long it lasted and what.
Now, do you want to speak at all about what prompted you to leave Atlanta to go back to New York?
Well, I mean, in this way it relates to sexual orientation stuff, because I wasn't sexual at all, right? Through high school and through college, this wasn't. And I probably would have stayed asexual. I mean, and it wasn't like a horrible thing, like, oh God, I don't have a boyfriend, I will never have. It wasn't. I didn't feel like that. I was involved with stuff I loved, and I was doing that work. But turned out, without saying too much, in the EOA program in that particular office, there was a guy who, I found out later, he very much loved to seduce, women in general, and did that with other people in the program. And here he saw this young woman from New York who was naive and everything. So he really went after me, and I had a sexual relationship with him. I only found out a lot into it that he was married, and also that he also was having sexual relationship with another woman who worked at. I mean, it was like, and I was like, I felt like, oh, I love him, I love him. I didn't have anything to compare it to, so, like from experience, I loved him. And then when I found out what was the situation, it was pretty devastating, like, oh my God. this is terrible, you know. So I decided, even though I loved being here and I wanted to keep working in the program, it was just I just wanted to get away from it because of that. So I had my first heterosexual experience, my first sexual experience. And it wasn't, people say, oh, well, it was terrible. It wasn't like, oh, this is horrible. I didn't have this feeling of, oh, this is terrible stuff. And he was very good at, you know, helping me have an orgasm. So it wasn't like, you know, what am I doing? So I still didn't have any sense that, until I had my first sexual experience with a woman, what the difference would be. And that was really clear. Then it became like, it was like, almost like oh my God, you know.
So then when you went back to New York for that,
it was like a few months.
What did you do up in New York?
I got a job in the American Cancer Society. It was a job doing, I don't know what they call it now, but it was helping prepare pictures and text and arranging things for their publications. Okay. So it borrowed a little on my high school art background more than anything else. But at American Cancer Society, at that time I was looking now for things that were relevant, that were, you know, places I'd want to work, you know, kind of thing.
How did your progressive politics fit in with your family and your parents? Was it similar to their views? Was it different?
Well, my parents, I would say, if I had to say, I think they were pretty progressive. I mean, they certainly didn't come out and say they were socialists or leftists or anything like that, although there were some in my family, from what I gathered, a little bit I gathered from talking about some other, you know, aunts and uncles. But they weren't like that. They were very, they weren't very political. I knew they were Democrat, they voted Democratic, that kind of thing, but that wasn't a big thing to them. What to discuss politics or anything like that. Yeah. So I certainly wasn't unusual that I would end up with the politics I did, but it wasn't also obvious. My brother, for instance, was very different. I often think, we grew up in the same family. How the heck did we grow up in the same family? He's really, really different politically, and how he responded, as everybody did, to my being, you know, gay was not real. So anyway,
Are you close now with your brother?
Never got real close to my brother, unfortunately. Even when I moved back to New York, later we'll talk about moving back to New York. I wanted to have, now that I was an adult, I really feel like we could, because we kind of stayed apart from each other. We fought a lot when we were kids, kind of brother, sister, 4 years difference. You know, he would fool around, we'd play with me, and, you know, and he'd have to babysit for me sometimes, and he hated that, and he'd go out sometimes and just leave me there. You know, I mean, we didn't have a best relationship growing up. And I figured we're adults now when I get back. But I think he had developed his hold. This is who his friends were, this is how his life was. And it wasn't like on the level of any kind of depth that we would connect.
Gotcha.
So on a surface level. So, yeah, it's unfortunate.
So you were at the American Cancer Society in New York.
And then I was applying to graduate schools. I knew I was going to go into graduate school once I decided to stop Vista. So I
graduate school in what subject?
Psychology.
Psychology.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I had. You know,
and so, what schools were you looking at?
I don't even remember all the schools, but there were a lot of schools, and I got accepted in a few places, including UNC, which had a special program which I was kind of interested in, which was parapsychology. And so I thought that would be interesting. So I got accepted there and other places, but then I applied to Emory because I thought maybe I'll want to come back to Atlanta. And by that time, it was like I got to the place where I want to go back to Atlanta because I really like Atlanta.
What was it about Atlanta that
I liked the people, I liked the city, I liked the pace. I think New York was basically too crazy for me, and that's how I learned to be. And a lot of people saw me like that and still do. I'll react like that, but it wasn't. I don't think it was good for me. And even when I was back there, I kind of loved New York in a lot of ways, but that wasn't something I ever loved, you know. Too much, too fast, and I liked it down here.
Let me ask one thing about New York before we get back to Atlanta. Given that you went back there in 1970, this was right at the very beginning of sort of gay liberation and awareness of gay issues, and right after Stonewall.
And I had
Do you remember anything in the media?
I looked at myself and I said, 69, here I am in Vista, in Atlanta, a very progressive bunch of people in Vista, working on civil rights and race issues and anti-war, and I had no connection or sense that I had any knowledge of what was happening, that I even heard about the Stonewall thing that happened in New York. I don't know if Atlanta papers would even cover something like that, probably not. So no, I had no, and there I was, I had just missed it, kind of. It was very,
So then when you were back in New York in 1970, you didn't have any interactions?
I had no connections with my sexual orientation, the gay community, nothing at all. I reconnected with, I had friends where I worked, and a lot of them were anti-war, and so I began working in a group that was working against the Vietnam War and doing anti-war stuff and leafleting and tabling and stuff like that. And that's what I got involved in. So no, and I laugh at myself because I think back now, and I even have pictures of people that I work with, and there was one guy, a black man, his name is John, who everybody loved. He was a real handsome guy, and everybody had a crush on him, and he was just so friendly, and so John, we would always joke about him, and people would have crushes on him, and would talk about trying to go out with him, and he lived with his cousin Tony. And I think back and I go, oh my God, this wasn't his cousin, Tony. He was gay and he lived with his partner. I am sure of that. I don't even have to, because I think back now and I think of knowing gay culture and knowing gay men and kind of how they are and what they sound like and how they, yeah. And I don't know if anybody else was like less naive than me and kind of really knew who John was. I don't know. But I knew I was completely like, very interesting, right? So no, I had no.
Wow.
It was only later when I found through feminism and found women's community and realized how comfortable I was with other women in relationships and friendships and relationships and having the emotional connection and that maybe something else was going on. I never had boyfriends. I never really was interested. I didn't care whether people So it was interesting.
So you get back to Atlanta to start graduate school. Talk to me a little bit about that.
And this is the way I where I lived and the way I lived was how I got connected with women who were coming out in feminisms. I had to find a place to live, right? And so I don't even remember, there was probably a way you could say I'm looking for people to live with, and I'm a student here too, kind of at Emory. Anyway, I lived with a group of students, people who were graduate students. Most of them in psychology, but there was one woman who was, she was going to be in med school, but she was doing, what's the word? When you work as a druggist, pharmacy. She was studying pharmacy, being a pharmacist.
What part of town did you live in?
That was in Virginia Highlands, and we lived in a couple of different places there, St. Louis Place and Drury, but right in Virginia Highlands is where we lived. We rented a house. And there were a group of us, and there were us and our animals, and we all went to school. And I realize now, once again, this is like believe me, I was so oblivious to the gay thing, or who could be a lesbian, who could be gay. And maybe it was some kind of mechanism to, if I didn't want to see that, I didn't want anything more about me or who I might be, maybe, I don't know. But that wasn't a conscious thing. It wasn't like, I don't want to know that. It was like, so there was a woman I lived with who I realized later, she had her best friend come visit us one time, and they stayed together, and I'm going now, oh my God, this is like her, this isn't her best friend, Plus she had another friend of hers come visit who was clearly lesbian, turns out, because she got involved, the first person, if anybody I knew, to get involved with these lesbian feminists who were all coming out. And it was this community of people, and they were all people from other social justice organizations and groups and lives, and they were leftist. And these are the people who, a lot of them started Alpha. And they lived in a couple of communal households also, all women. And they were in the food co-op, and that's the connection. We all knew them and saw them because of the food co-op, and we'd all go to somebody's backyard to distribute the food that particular week, And she got involved with them, and then I started getting to know them. And I liked the politics, and I liked, so there was other things happening I don't even remember what they are. You have some of the names there, I think, but there was the Anti-Imperialist Coalition, and there was Sojourner Truth Press, which is a women's press, which some of those women were running. Anyway, they were coming out, and there was this thing. Some of them had gone to the Vince Ramos Brigade and had really clashed about the anti-gay stuff that was coming from the organizers of the brigade, and how whether they should be out or not.
And what is the brigade? Can you tell me a little
the
bit
Vince
about
Ramos Brigade was a series of support, kind of, to Cuba, to the Cuban Revolution. People would be selected from organizations in North America and other places to go to Cuba to do the sugar harvest with the Cubans, and they'd also, while down there, learn a lot about the Cuban Revolution and the society and the politics. So the Vince Ramos Brigade, and I never went on one, but there were a lot of these women who had gone on. And one of the issues at that time was these were all progressive women and from leftist organizations and had done social justice work, but they were coming out. And it was, communists at that time were pretty anti-gay, so that was an issue. And so they were finding kind of being rejected in certain ways here, rejected over here from the Gay Liberation Front, which was mostly men, and not enough of them had enough of the social feminist consciousness. So these are the women that kind of were coalescing and forming these households and groups. And when I started learning about it was like, oh, and I started getting real comfortable and started hanging out with people and supporting gay folks, gay liberation, and then all of a sudden, I don't know why, it was just so clear to me, the physical comfort of hugging women and viewing back rubs with each other, and that this was something that I wanted more than just that. And then ended up getting, when I was still living with the graduate students, getting sexually coming out with another woman who was another Alpha co-founder, and it was like, oh my God,
Do you have memories of that first experience, or how that or how that evolved?
Yeah, but it was it was kind of an awkward situation, because I don't know why we were on the floor, whether we all had mattresses on the floor at that time. It may be because my mother, I think, when they visited once, she said, "Why don't you have any furniture? You don't have a real bed." I think we just had some mattresses on the floor. And I remember this other woman staying over that night, because we were friends and we knew each other, hanging out, and she stayed over, and and then we made love. And so it was looking uncomfortable. It was in the middle of like a lot of other people, it was a house full of people, and we were on the so it wasn't probably the most conducive, but the whole idea is that the attraction that I felt, and that sexually, this was much more comfortable, and I liked it, and it wasn't at all like, oh my God, don't do this to it wasn't at all. So it was almost like, people say this was this was probably more me than than my experience with someone, a man seducing me and then having sex with him, because this is the way you do it if you have a relationship with a man, But it wasn't, I don't know how to describe it. It's real different.
So
the level of
after the
connection.
experience, did you immediately then sort of make the mental recognition in yourself that, oh, this may be who I am, or did you?
Oh, I'd already done that before. I think I'd already. I don't know the timing on this. I remember distinctly how I admitted it publicly, but I think I'd already knew inside.
I was just curious as to how close within yourself this sort of physical.
Yeah, came to
the oh, this is who I am. The mental realization.
I think the realization was before that, because I don't think if I hadn't really figured that or accepted that inside, I wouldn't have probably had had sex.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I can't remember the timing. I tell you the truth, it's all mixed up now, because I'm thinking I thought it was after I had left that household, but it wasn't. Interesting. I do remember the way I came out publicly and admitted who I was there was going to be a May Day conference in Atlanta. And before it, there was a day which was what they put aside for a women and gay conference, kind of a day-long thing for women and gays.
And what was the May Day conference?
The May Day conference was a leftist conference. May Day, with the original idea of May Day, was a workers' holiday and a celebration of workers' rights, and And so it was being celebrated here by a lot of leftists and progressive groups. And it wasn't just for Atlanta, it was people coming from a lot of different places. And so I was going to that, and when you sign up, you had to say, well, you were going to the women or gay conference, and then, the question was straight, gay, you had to say, kind of check off. And I was like, well, gay, And that was the first time that I really admitted that and said that. I'm pretty sure that was in 71, but it might have been in 72. Did I have 71
in your timeline, you mentioned it as 71.
Yeah, okay. Because it was before Alpha, even the discussions even happened about having a separate lesbian organization.
Yeah, I do want to get to Alpha in a second. I do want to mention in some of your activities from this time, you mentioned the Great Speckled Bird, and I'm just curious, did you write for them?
Yeah.
What types
when I
of
left graduate
articles?
school...
and when you say left graduate school, you mean quit or graduated?
Yes, I dropped out. It was a PhD program, right? And I was there 2 years. And a little more about that because I didn't know. I figured I'd become a PhD psychologist. I didn't know what I wanted to do. At first, it was going to be experimental psychology because I was still real connected to science, and that's what I really liked, and research and stuff. So my first year was in experimental psychology. And then I got so involved with these political things and community work and stuff, and I was like, wow, maybe I should make this more relevant. I'm not going to be like an ivory tower researcher. That's terrible. I don't want to do that. So then I switched. I thought this would be to clinical psychology because at least there you're working with people, right? And so second year I was in clinical psychology, but it just didn't work. I was going to have to be a full-time student, especially if I was going to do my thesis and then go on to get a PhD. And I just didn't want to be what I really wanted to do was the work I was doing outside of school, in community. So I decided to drop out. But that second year, I remember the head of the clinical psychology department, I found out, not immediately but later, was a lesbian. And that's when I came out to my parents during that time also. And I wrote them a letter and everything. And among their responses, one obvious thing, my mother, of course, you should talk to somebody. You're in psychology. Why don't you go and talk to a therapist? Please go talk to somebody. And I got real snotty when I wrote back and said, yeah, maybe I'll go talk to the head of the psychology department. She's a lesbian. She'd probably be able to help me. So anyway, it was not very kind.
So I was going to say, since you brought it up, because I was curious as to when you came out to your family, how did you immediately know that you wanted to come out to your family?
No, I didn't come out immediately after in fact, interestingly enough, the woman who I came out with sexually, I'm not even sure if I should use her name. I guess it'd be perfectly okay with her. She's one of the people that we were going to interview.
Just know you can use her name, and it can be, as you go through after, you can say you want it redacted.
Well, and Elaine KUB is a woman who I came out with sexually, and she was one of the co-founders of Alpha also, and she had the first lesbian show on WRFG. WRFG and the Bird and that whole community was very much involved in kind of community and leftist politics, and I was very involved in that. And your question was about WRFG? I'm sorry, I lost.
No, about your work with the Bird.
Oh, okay.
What did you write? What type of things?
And at that point, I remember it being, it had existed for quite a few years, and there was a women's caucus, a gay caucus, and so I was, by the way, everybody learned, it was cooperative, everybody kind of eventually learned all the jobs, it's the idea of it. And everybody, no matter what you did, also helped do the layout, help put the actual paper together. And I remember at one point I was the local news editor and reporter. Anyway, so everybody did a lot of stuff. And I don't even remember in detail a lot of them. I know I wrote some stuff. I'd love to go back and when I had time and look and try to see what articles I ended up writing, because I don't even remember local news. I remember, though, going to cover, I think it was the first ever Southeast Gay Conference. And I have pictures of Me, a woman named Jane. At that time, her name was Jane Lifflander, who was also one of the early Alpha co-founders. Pam Norris Hatchett, known as Hatchet, and we all were going there to cover both for WRFG and for the Bird, the gay conference. And I had pictures of them, doing filming and taping, and so we did stuff like that.
And how long did you work with the Bird?
It was like a year and a half. It was it was wonderful. It was intense though, and you didn't make much money. It was like $50 a week, and you worked like 60, 80 hours a week. It was like you kept working for as long as you needed to, kind of thing. So yeah, that was, and there were people there that I still know and reconnected with later on. There was a Bird reunion, and was able to go to that in Atlanta and have some connection with. Some of the people are still around and still doing, the WRFG stuff and doing other, political and community work. Yeah.
Well, I want to just jump back to one thing before we continue down that path. The issue of you coming out to your parents. You said it happened around this time. What prompted you to do it at that point?
I don't remember if it was any specific thing. I do remember that I was, I don't know if I should call it chicken, or why didn't I come out when I was up visiting them? Because I go up and visit them, but they come down very often. And after I already had come out, I actually went up and visited them, and Elaine was with me. If I'm not remembering wrong, Elaine was with me, but we didn't say anything about who we were. This was a friend of mine, kind of thing, I think. I'm getting some stuff mixed up now. I don't know if she was or if it was Bonnie. It was one time we went up and hitchhiked up to New York. I didn't tell my parents I was hitchhiking, but we hitchhiked up there with another woman who was a lesbian in the lesbian community. Didn't say anything to them about that, and it was I came back, and then I ended up having kind of a series of. At first, it was very unpopular to be monogamous. Being open to having different relationships was really much more politically, correct. So then Elaine, and there were some other women that I had a relationship with too, and I guess I just thought I should, as I developed politically, I guess, and what I wanted to do. I don't know whether I thought, oh, they'll know it anyway. I can't really honestly remember if there was an impetus, if there was a reason. I just thought, well, Lorraine, you should tell your parents who you are. Maybe because, parents are always going to be asking you about your relationships. You have a boyfriend, because they want you to get married and have kids and have a life. That's the life to them, having married and having kids. So probably I thought I need to let them know.
And so
that's not going to happen.
So then how did you come out to them again?
I wrote a letter. I didn't. It was like between visits. So I wrote them a letter, nice long letter, and I wish I had my letter. I have their letters, but I don't have my letter. I don't remember how very political it sounded, or if I used psychology. I don't know how I wrote it, but it was more like really wanting to let them know this is who I was, and I was very positive about it, saying I was wonderful. That I don't want them to be sad about it, because I don't feel like it's something horrible or negative about me. I feel good. I really, it's a lovely way to be, and so it was that kind of. And that, of course, they didn't get it all. Like, they didn't accept that. Like, this is as good as being. No, you never have a love of a man. Don't you want to know? And because my mother immediately was, oh, you at least could try having a relationship with a man. You don't know what you're missing. You don't have any idea. How do you know you're, it's got kind of someone did this to you and you don't know. I hadn't told them about I had a sexual relationship in Vista. I wasn't going to tell them. I went down to Vista and had, a sexual affair with somebody. So then I told them.
What was their reaction?
Well, I remember the back and forth was, so then after it's like, oh, it must have been a terrible relationship. No wonder now you went to women, because this guy was so terrible and horrible. So it was anything they could grab onto, they would, use that and say, there must be a reason for this. And my mother was the one that really had the problem. a lot more than my father did.
I was going to ask, can you talk a little bit about how each reacted and
Yeah.
how they were different?
Well, because the original letter I got back, and it wasn't right away either. It wasn't like an automatic back letter, and I was worried. It was like weeks and weeks. I was saying, "Uh-oh, what's going on?" I didn't call them. I was waiting for, because my father and I would write back and forth all the time. My mother didn't write that much, but my father did. Nothing. So then I finally get the letter, and it's like this really thick letter, because they would write something, and then a couple of days later they wouldn't send it, and they would write some more, and so it was like a series of letters. And they both were kind of like, what can I say? My father was definitely disappointed and like sorry about hearing that, and was worried. But my mother was more horrified. I would use that word. That's kind of how it felt to me. In the archives is this letter. So to be accurate, I would have to have it in front of me. But it was something like, some of the things she said were, "I couldn't have been more shocked if you had said you were a murderer." And it was like, holy shit. And then, of course, my response to her, I think, because of another letter she sent back, she said something like, "I didn't say you were a murderer or you were like a murderer. That's not what I meant, Lorraine." It was like, so my response was, "Oh, so it's like being gay is like being a murderer." Yeah, I was very, very angry about that. And that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. I love you. I still love you, but they always said that. They always said. So I didn't have the experience of either change or you're not in our family anymore or we don't want to associate with you. Because they didn't have that religious. They weren't these religious people who could say, "Jesus said," or Christianity says, because that's not them. They weren't. But, of course, it was society that said this was sick and something is wrong with you. You should get help, And that lasted a while with my mother, and I remember calling after getting one or two of these, letters back from her. And by her writing a long letter was very unusual, so I knew, wow, this is really it's really affecting her. So I called and got my father, and I said, "How's Mom doing?" He said, "She's really having a hard time, she's really having a hard time." And he said, "But I've been thinking about it, and I really love women, so I could see how you love women too." He did. I mean, it was like great. It was like, so he really, I think he changed a lot quicker than my mom, and he might have actually accepted who I was. And my mother found out later, never really did. Well, let's put it this way: she accepted it in the sense of she's my daughter and I love her, and so, but not in the sense of this is just, this is some people are gay and some people, no. She thought there was still something, not right, and oh, my daughter's this terrible sick person. I should feel sorry for her. I think she kind of was at that level. Let me give you another example. We're jumping ahead, but I want to give a follow-up to that. It's like I found this out only these things later when she was, right before she died, really, and she would talk more about things, anything. The reason I know that she wasn't that accepting, although she wanted to show she still loved me and support me, was they came down to Atlanta once during June, and it was when there was going to be a Pride march. And they decided to go to the march. They couldn't march the whole way, so they were sitting at a certain place. I told them what the route was, and they were going to just join us as we came by, and they would walk the rest of the way in a short distance. And they had agreed to that. And it was like, wow, my parents were like, "Your parents are going to be in the march, wow," And they did that, and we marched, and everyone was real like, "Oh, wow," and I was, of course, I was very appreciative of them being able to do that and everything. So I'm talking to my mom. I didn't even ask her about that, and she was going on about how worried she was about me and how scared she was, and people would hurt me, and people and your father wanted us to go to that march that time, and your father said I had to go, and I didn't want to, and I was scared people were going to jump on us, and she was like terrified that anti-gay people would see her and would do something, and so it was really, and she hadn't ever said that. So it was like, there she was being brave and being, and acting like she was happy to be there. And she was, very worried. Yeah. So in a way, it was a double thing. It was like, oh, how wonderful that she was able to do that for me. She would do that for me, you know. But also, she never really, she just remained in a way very scared of it totally and not understanding. And
were you out to your broader family? Did you come out to your broader family?
I wasn't anywhere near them anymore. So when I came out, I said, I remember from responses, again, the letters that I've been reading from them, they said things like, oh no, you could tell people if you want to. It's like I probably told them, you could tell anybody in your family, the family know, you know, that I'm a lesbian, and the response was, well, if you want to, you tell them. We're not gonna say anything. It's up to you. We don't want to. But it was clear that I had no problem with being out to anybody. So eventually, everyone in my family knew it. Just that I didn't have like common contact with a lot of them anymore. Like either they were up there or they had my cousins and aunts and uncles had moved all around the country, kind of thing. So it wasn't. Yeah. So I think most of them even knew early on, but then eventually they obviously knew, and they certainly. I mean, I think they knew before my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, because Barbara and I, my partner at that time, went up for that, and we were coupled there. It was clear, you know. I think everybody knew already before that, but that cinched it if anybody didn't, I'm sure.
Now, when you came out to your parents, did you also come out to your brother at the same time, or did they tell your brother?
Yeah, they must have told him. Like I said, I didn't have any real good connection with him growing up, and there I was moved away now. I wasn't even living. So we had very little connection. In fact, it's kind of sad, but I kept in contact with my parents a lot, and we'd go, and I see him when I go back to visit New York, of course. But he got married, and him and Helen, I would see them only then. And I don't think he ever called me in Atlanta all the years I lived down there, except one time when I had my bad car accident. I almost died. He called then, but that was it.
Wow.
So obviously we don't have a usual brother-sister relationship.
Well, we will pick up back on that as we get down. But we've heard you refer to this several times in the interview so far, and I want to make sure we get this documented very well. You have referenced Alpha. Can you talk about what Alpha was, how it got started, what your role was, et cetera, and what its role was within the broader Atlanta community?
Well,
and when this happened?
72 was when we first had our first official Alpha meeting, although we obviously have been talking about having a lesbian organization before that.
And Alpha stands for?
Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance. And it was the first out lesbian group in Atlanta. Now, I say out lesbian because I'm assuming there were lots of networks, friendship networks of gay women, lesbians, that just weren't public organizations. They were, people would go to each other's houses, and that existed clearly. But this was the first, kind of in a political sense, an out lesbian organization. Come join us, we're a lesbian organization, we have women-only space, come and be with other women. And it formed by all kinds of women, some women who were involved in the Gay Liberation Front, and some women, there's women I've been discussing who were involved in other social justice movements and had become feminists because of their involvement with those movements that were sometimes very patriarchal and very male-dominated. And then other lesbians who, once they heard about there's a lesbian organization, wanted to join, and weren't necessarily coming from a background of leftist politics, but were feminist. So there were different kind of groups that helped form it. And I remember one of the early discussions being around the name, and so we felt we were feminists, but we were lesbians, so we should say lesbian, and would it be only for lesbians or for all women? So there was discussion around that, and we finally decided it should be for lesbians, but that there was no, blood test for lesbianism. There was no card-carrying lesbian organization. So, like if you said you wanted to be an Alpha, you wanted to be in Lesbian Feminist Alliance, you could be in it. No one said, let's test to make sure she's had a relationship with a woman. So there were women who were willing to say they were lesbians and be in a lesbian organization who hadn't necessarily come out yet, but they were feminists. It was kind of interesting. Some of them did actually come out. Most of them did. But, but we decided it needed to have lesbian in the name for sure. So, and once you have lesbian in your name, you're going to not get certain people who are not going to want to.
And again,
they don't want to be out, they're not going to be an alpha.
That year was, what year was this?
72.
72.
That was, it was June of 72 that we had our first alpha meeting, official alpha meeting. But before that, like I said, there had been people meeting, and some of us had been involved in Gay Liberation Front. We'd go to their dances, and we'd go to meetings, and we had gone to the first, LGBT Pride March. And I was, even before I came out, I was always said I was a supporter of gay rights, and that's when there was Chuck's Rathskeller was the first bar that I knew about. Now, there were a lot of men's bars at that time, but I didn't know about them. But Chuck's Rathskeller was a mixed bar on Monroe, right where that health food store is now.
Trader Joe's?
Trader Joe's, that's where it was.
Can you describe it?
Yeah, it was this big building, kind of big open building, and you went in, and it was big dance floor and everything, and there were these tables like this, these long tables. This is two put together, but there was long, like a lunchroom type tables, like you'd see in a school lunchroom, and they were all set up around it. So you'd sit around this table with all kinds of other people, like maybe your friends, but maybe other people. So it was kind of it was very unusual. It didn't seem like the same kind of bar atmosphere as the bars you think of, and the bars I even went to later on, where you went to them at night. It was dark, and it was very, small and dark, and no one wanted to see each other. This was if I remember, it was very open and well lit, and there were all kinds of people there, people that were gay and straight, who were supporters. At that time, there was all the sexual revolution stuff, the hippie stuff, the leftist stuff. All those communities kind of blended. It was a very open thing about supporting, sexual revolution, including gay people wanting to come out and be who they were. So I remember when I first started going there, I didn't even identify yet as lesbian, but it was a very comfortable kind of place to go, yeah. What were we talking about? Alpha.
About alpha, and I want you to continue the story. I'm just curious, what type of reaction, if any, and maybe it wasn't immediate, did you get from other feminist organizations? Was it supportive? Did they ignore you?
Well, I myself was never a member of Atlanta Women's Liberation. There was an organization here. I knew people in it, and I did some work around feminist issues like the ERA, but I was never part of it, so I can't tell you from my own experience this is how these women reacted. I know certainly from the history of the stories that, no, there were a lot of people very upset about women coming out who were in women's liberation, and that they knew who were now coming out as lesbians. And that was seen as a threat by a lot of people, just like Betty Friedan's feeling like this was a lavender heaven. This is you're taking us off our real issue of feminism. That's not an issue of feminism, lesbian rights. And that's how some people saw it, and some people obviously didn't. There were a lot of women, I still know, some people who, straight women who were very supportive and who still are, and who always were. But there were some women who were very, disassociate themselves from us, and you get out of here. The ERA coalition, the Jordans for the Equal Rights Amendment, there's a lot of clashes around whether Alpha as an out organization should be a member and should be part of, be very visible in the marches. So there was a lot of that kind of controversy. That was our example of what had happened all over the country with lesbians, women coming out as lesbians, being in the women's movement, and now the threat of men being able to say, see, I knew that's what you all were to begin with. You all went to dykes, that's who you are, women. You hate men, and blah, blah, blah. So it was very touchy for a lot of people. I didn't want to be used against them, and some of them didn't want to be anti-lesbian, but in effect, if they asked people to be closeted and they asked people not to participate in a certain way, it was demonstrating the homophobia of the movement and not being able to connect and intersect all those, the race and class and gender and sex sexual orientation, all as one movement. A lot of people felt like that, and some people didn't. You'll find that in every one of those groups, people who didn't think, that's not our issue, why are you concerned about that? And women's movement, there were some people like that in the women's movement, just like there were and people of color, black movement who felt that way, and just like you were in the socialist and communist groups that existed that felt bringing in women's issues and gay issues were getting us away from the real issue of class,
So then Alpha was formed in, you said June of 72 was the first meeting.
Right.
What were some of your initial activities or projects, and how large was the organization?
Probably don't even remember very well. I could say what I think, but might not be accurate.
That's fine.
Numbers, I'm thinking of the early meetings. We had a lot of people come to meetings, so maybe there would be, I say a lot, I say like 20 people at a meeting. That seemed like a lot of people. That once in a while we'd end up having 2 people at a meeting, after people got really tired. At the beginning you have meetings all the time because you're trying to figure out, beside your name, what are you about? What are your goals? What are your, principles and all that stuff. A lot of people just got tired of that. Like they just wanted to have a place to come to meet women and to have fun and to have a library. So that was one thing we had as a library, and some of us contributed the books we had because we were readers and loved, So we contributed our books to make a library, and then we would start connecting with other groups that had magazines and books being published, and we'd offer this for that. We'd offer our newsletter to get a copy of a book or another periodical. So we then had a growing library that was really pretty good at one time. But at the beginning it was just whatever we had, and then we'd see a book come out, someone would buy it because they thought this was, Lesbian Nation came out, we had to buy Lesbian Nation. So, So we had a library, and we had, by the way, we had women's only space, so we always wanted to have a house where we would have our meetings, we would have social events, we would watch a movie together, whatever we wanted to do. So the first house was a house that I lived in, actually. Some of us lived in the house, and our bedrooms were upstairs, and the downstairs became the Alpha House. This was on Mansfield Avenue, right off Moreland. The first house on Mansfield, if you're going from Moreland down Mansfield, first house on the left was the Alpha House. It's still there. It's all been renewed and everything. But remember, back then, Little Five Points, Candler Park, and Inman Park were all very cheap places to live because they had been, for a couple of decades before, white flight had happened, where people that owned those homes had fled because they didn't want to be near black people moving in near them, and they were renting out their houses, and sometimes they were breaking them up into small, apartments. So it's cheap, and that's where a lot of the lesbian kind of groups and communes that formed ended up living in Inman Park and Candler Park. I remember our rent was something like $120 a month or something for the house. It was a 2-story house. So we lived there, and that's how we paid the rent and had the space. But it was a women-only space, which meant any women, lesbian or otherwise, were invited to come to open houses, to game nights or movies or I'm trying to remember the other things we had. Sometimes we had CR groups started pretty early, consciousness raising groups. That was a thing that women did at that time. We had a couple of those, and we had our meetings there. We had the library, and it could be like resource. Like we had a number. We decided we'd have a phone number. Now nobody was staffing that phone all the time, but we had an answer machine, so that somebody was responsible for like checking the answer machine, because people would call who found out about us finally when we had started having a newsletter and trading it with other newsletters, and it would be put in Lesbian Connection that Alpha existed, and here's how to contact them. So people would call who were moving to Atlanta, who were stopping in Atlanta, who wanted a place to stay, or wanted to know more about how to get in contact with other women. And so we had a phone, and of course when we lived there, we were the ones that would answer the phone and help people find us, or give them information and get them on the newsletter list. Now the newsletter, remember, we're talking about in the early 70s, it was mimeographed.
With the purple ink?
Remember mimeographed? Anyway, it was like, I remember I hated it because it was always having to really get the right amount in the right place. And if you look at some of the even copies that exist, Elizabeth Knowlton, who became an Alpha member a couple of years into Alpha after it started, she was she's an archivist herself and librarian, so she was very interested in helping us start, keeping kind of a better record and keeping things in better order. And we started a newsletter, and I remember that she's kept one of everything. She thought ahead. Now she's the one that has this archive of every one, I think, of our newsletters. And I got her copies and scanned them. So we now have, but it's very hard to read some of them, because whatever copy she had, sometimes it was too light, sometimes it was, mimeograph wasn't like making a copy or something. So some of them you can read, some of them are kind of hard. And they were on colored paper sometimes, so making copies of those.
Where was the newsletter distributed? Was it at locations, or did you mail them to people?
There was a mailing list. It was a post that we had, we did bulk mailing. And we had a P.O. box. We decided not to ever put the Alpha House address in our publicity, but the P.O. box. And that, I think about it now, and I think it clearly was a sign of still worrying, being danger, that people would come and want to do something. Also, people didn't put we decided people would not put their last names. We wouldn't put people's last names in the newsletters unless they themselves wanted their last names in the newsletter, because people were still afraid, whether they were a lesbian organization or not. That seemed to be pretty out, that somebody, if their job or their family would see them in a lesbian newspaper, and they'd have a problem. So interesting. There was still that sense of closet, in terms of, we don't want to let you know where we are. If you tell us, you call us, you tell us you want to know, we'll give you the address so you can find us. But you have to call or write,
How many people did you mail the newsletter out to, roughly?
I don't remember. I don't have a good sense of that at all. I mean, the biggest we were in terms of membership was a couple of hundred actual members. We had a yearly membership. We had paid every year some membership, which would give you a newsletter for free. Now, you could get just a newsletter and not be a member. So I think we had more than a couple of hundred went out, but I don't have a good sense of how many hundreds might have gone out.
Now, over the years, with the phone number and people calling in, did you ever get hate calls or people, or were they always nice, or did people do that?
I just don't remember. I honestly don't remember that. I'm sure that there was some stuff like that, especially if there was, not very many. You know why? Because where we would put information like what our number was or how to get a hold of us would be in the LGBT publications that existed, in our newsletter, in flyers that we handed out at bars, gay bars. So maybe in the Bird, maybe through the Bird, something like that, somebody who was straight would see that info. But then if you're buying the Bird, if you've got a gay bar, you think most of those people, they're not going to start calling. So it was only very few people who were probably outside of that.
So you did not have it listed in the phone book? Or did you?
I don't even know. I do not remember. That's terrible. I don't remember whether Alpha was listed. And it may have been one of those issues where we couldn't get it listed, because the Learned Journal Constitution wouldn't list us because they had the word lesbian. They would not publish anything about us. We picketed them.
Talk a little bit about that.
Let's see. There were some pickets. It was right downtown, of course, where they were. And I wish I had my notes with me, because there were all kinds of, no, not those, but my other notes, because that's the only way I can remember all the organizations that supported us. Because it was, there weren't any other, except for the Gay Liberation Front, there weren't any other gay lesbian organizations, right? It was us and the Gay Liberation Front. Oh, MCC existed too. So MCC and Gay Liberation Front. But then there were all these other, social justice political organizations that supported us, and that had people come down and picket with us.
So what had you tried to do? Had you tried to place an ad in the paper, or what?
Yeah. It was an ad about, probably our meetings, where, how to get in touch with us and when our meetings were. I think it was about the meetings. We wanted people to know how to get to a meeting and come and join. And
so then how did you learn?
And I don't know if just the picketing that we did.
No, but how did the group learn then that the paper would not publish it? Did they call you, or?
I don't remember. I wasn't directly involved in that particular.
But they just let you know they would not publish.
Yeah, whatever way you do it, whether you have to call them or write out, you have to probably send in something written or go down there, and they probably just told us right away, we weren't going to They weren't going to use that word in their paper, and they weren't going to publish it. In fact, it took a while, I guess, for them to use gay or lesbian.
So then the picket occurred, was it a one-time picket, or was this ongoing?
I can't remember now whether it was a series of days that we did it. I really don't remember. I don't remember if we did it until they changed their mind, or we just did it for get publicity, because, I mean, I pick it out in front of the Downtown Constitution, you know, so you probably
How many people would you say were there at the pickets?
Jeez. I'll be lying, I don't remember. I really don't.
Do you have a sense, was it small or large? Or?
For me, at that time, it seemed large, because that meant, I mean, think of it now. We're talking about the early 70s being queer out in the street, so having 25 people would seem big, you know. And I don't know whether that's what we had or if there were more people, but I don't remember. I really don't. And maybe, I'm trying to remember whether it was too early for the newsletter. The newsletter started in fall of 73. So that was like a year and a half, almost a year and a half later after we started, and I don't know how early this was that we. I'd look in our newsletter to determine if they had.
How long was the newsletter printed for? How many years?
Until we closed.
And that was when?
94.
94. Okay. And we'll come back to that. So I'm interested in the women-only space.
Yeah.
Was there discussion in the group at all as to what if one of your very progressive male friends who you might consider a feminist wanted to come?
No, it was women only. It was very clearly women only.
And I understand, but was there ever discussion like, well, this, you know, if we have
let me say it this way. Women only space is very important. Mm-hmm. But early on, I remember, and this I got from reading back to the newsletters myself at one time when I was scanning them. We had one of the early gay prides. We had an open house where everybody was invited. So it was like that day, it was an exception. That day, men and people could come in. So that happened. But it was a special event or a special occasion where we changed the general rule. In fact, it was so strict. This one, I always remember this story because it kind of breaks my heart still. This was at the first Alpha House now in Mansfield, so it was very early. And sometimes there would be women who, like I said, would find us and would be passing through and didn't have a place to stay yet, so they would stay with us. So these two women staying with us that had a little girl. I'm not even sure whether they were the biological parents of the little girl, but the little girl was, how old was she? 3 or 4, something like that. But she was a baby dyke, we call her, because she was really, her mothers were dykes. She was being brought up like that as a real feminist and real dyke, and so she had already picked up a lot of that kind of talk and, okay. So she was living in with us, and we got a call. I got a call on the Alpha line from a woman that identified as transsexual. In fact, then I would even said a man, because that's how I thought of it. A man who was a transsexual. And that's the word that we used back then, transsexual. So she said she wanted to know whether she could come by. She needed someone to talk to. She didn't have anybody to talk to. There were no out transgender support groups, you know. She really wondered whether, you know, we'd be open to talking with her and she could come by. And I talked to her a little bit. I said, yeah, come by. I said, you know, I'm Lorraine, come by. And I guess we didn't set a real specific time or whatever. Anyway, I knew she was going to be coming by, though. And I didn't know, and I don't remember if I asked her, would she be dressing as herself as a woman or would she be dressing as, I wasn't sure. I guess I was assuming she'd be dressing as a female, maybe. And then there wouldn't have been any problem. Okay. So when she comes, where it was, I don't know, whether I was just upstairs or out of the house, the little, and I forget her name now. But the little girl answered the door, and this transsexual woman came dressed in male, as a male. The little girl, I heard this story later from him. So when the little girl answered the door, she said, no, you can't come in here. There's only for women. You can't come in. And she shut the door in my face. It was just horrible. Like, and then she called back and explained what happened. And I apologized. I said I was so sorry. I said, you know, it's woman only space, and this little girl must have thought, you know, this is a man. He never came back. But that was kind of. I don't think even if it was one of the women who was there might have had, I don't know, if they would have, listened at all and said, this is who you are, you're transsexual, that's different. I don't have a sense, because we didn't have much discussion back then. There just wasn't enough people in the community who were raising that issue or that were saying, here we are, we want, to be part of the community, we want our rights. So that was an unusual call, an unusual kind of, and I guess at that time I tried to educate myself a little more. The only transsexual I'd ever knew about was that, what's her name, that woman who everybody knew about. It was such a big national...
Christine
Yes,
Jorgen.
Christine Jorgensen. So I had no other information. It's interesting. I knew drag queens, but I knew that they identified as men. They didn't identify, at least at that point, drag queens identified as male who were doing drag.
Right.
And that was a whole different story,
Now, at this time, at the beginning of Alpha, I know obviously you were very, as a group, politically focused and on women's rights, etc. Can you give me a sense or talk a little bit about Alpha's focus on the feminist issue versus the lesbian issue? And did you have interactions with gay males on the sexuality issue in terms of working together?
Oh, yeah. Well, that all happened. It all happened. And yes, we were very focused on actually the lesbian stuff. We were feminist, but we were very focused on, the reason we had formed a lesbian organization, because we weren't finding what we needed and wanted in some women's organizations, right? So yeah, the focus was on, in the consciousness raising groups, would be a lot around not only that we were women, but being a lesbian, what does that mean? And how did that affect us in our lives? And we were very involved, of course, with anything that existed around gay stuff, which wasn't that much at first. It was more like gay pride, of course, when that came around. Like I said, we would always be part of, they would ask what other group existed to have a program that would be part of that weekend. And so we would always do something like the open house, We'd have a series of things sometimes. And so we would always have representatives who would go to the gay pride committee and be part of that organizing effort. Now, my memory of that is not a very fun one, because, and I would go there and then I would not go and then I would go back, and then I went to law school, and when I came back I would do that some more. But it was very difficult because there were a lot of men there who weren't like Gay Liberation Front men, who were men now feeling very strong because they were coming out, but they had been gay and they were coming out now and they wanted their rights. But no feminist consciousness, no common sense in terms of gender. So didn't get their own sexism, didn't get that they took over everything, and that when they talked, everyone was supposed to listen, and that other people just got squashed with their. That was commonly what happened, and they were mostly white men, and so they didn't get their race privilege either, and so it was hard. It was like gritting your teeth sometimes to go and work with people. And there were some people that were feminists and had that consciousness. So it was a mixture, but it was a difficult kind of working situation sometimes. So some of us would deal with that, and some of us would be open to working with men and had male friends, and some people were separatists in the sense of, I don't put any energy into men and men's groups and men's organizations, and that was seen as that. Pride was seen as that, even though it was open to everybody. Just like black folks would look at Alpha or other organizations that existed then and think, this is white folks, I don't want to deal with that, even though they were open to everybody. It was the same kind of feeling.
Was Alpha at all racially integrated or mixed?
It only in the sense of it was open to all, and there were always a small percentage of, and I guess because it was black women and very occasionally women of other nationalities and racial backgrounds, but just a small percentage, always a small percentage. Always people there from the very beginning who are very interested and involved and want to be an Alpha, and mostly white. It was predominantly white, it always was, So, and the women who started it were very much, had a consciousness around race and class, and had worked in, civil rights movement, had worked in the Black Liberation Support sense of supporting, Black Panthers and the Black Liberation movement. So weren't, in that sense, had any ideology or lack of consciousness, but because we were white women that basically started Alpha, it's very difficult to say, oh, come on in, black women, join us. Well, us is like this white organization. They didn't have something to say about what Alpha would be and how it was formed. And so it's very, even being open, what we did was simply decide to be as conscious as we could. A lot of times we would try to have consciousness raising around the issues of race, programs focused on learning about racial history and what that meant. And so those are the things we could do, and always have interactions with other organizations when they did exist. There weren't any, for a long time, there weren't any out black organizations or out gay organizations. The first ones, I think there was a group called Sisters, the first black lesbian group that existed, and then there was ALGA, the Atlanta, oh my God, I forget what it stands for now. Oh my goodness, Carolyn Mobley was in it.
ALGA?
Yeah.
You can,
Anyway.
we can start it later.
Yeah. But anyway, at first, there weren't organizations within the black community that were coming out, that were at least that were noticed, that known by the white community people. We're still a very segregated society, and Atlanta at that time was very segregated.
Mm-hmm.
So you might, if you lived in a certain neighborhood, you weren't even going to get exposed to having friends who were in other groups. I know there were always, back then, the houses, the black houses that existed, and house parties, and social groups that were developed within the black community. I'll give you another example of my denial and not seeing anything. When I was in Vista, one of the women very involved in the area block club there and worked with this place called Shepherd's Gate, which was a youth center that a Christian group set up in the neighborhood, and that I would go to and work with. She lived right down the street from it, and so I got to know her, and I even lived with her for a while. I might have even lived with her for a brief period when I was looking for someplace else to move to, but it was over her house a lot. And I think back now and I go, oh my God! Not only was she a single woman, but all her friends were other women, black women, some of whom were things like physical ed teachers, and worked in the kind of typical jobs that lesbians work in, you know. And I think back and I go, oh, I know they had to have been lesbians, and they were all very friendly and open, and they probably were watching me and going, when is she going to figure out what she is, you know? As I think back, and they probably had a big kind of kick about that.
So,
but they were, and their groups were very, you know, they weren't out. They were in the closet in that sense. They were, but they had pretty much their own friendship, you know, network, and
right.
And those all existed, I'm sure, but we didn't know about them.
Now, you mentioned the house on Mansfield being the first Alpha house.
Yeah.
Where and when did the second Alpha house happen, and why did you move?
Yeah, I don't have the dates in my head. I know I recently kind of looked at that, but again.
Or do you have approximate, how long do you think you were at the first Alpha house? Was it a year, 2 years, 6 months?
I hate to guess. I guess it was a year, between a year or two.
Mm-hmm.
Year or two. And then, and I'm not sure what happened, because it must have been that the women living there, some left, and we didn't have enough women to keep running the place. It was like we didn't have a place for a while. It was like we weren't going to live there, so there wasn't going to be any Alpha house, because we couldn't afford, we didn't have the money to afford to just rent a place with nobody living there who paid the rent.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a while, maybe, I don't even know how many months it was. 6 months, a year, I don't know how long it was. I don't remember, that we were looking for another place. And I had taken the books from the library, and put it in my apartment. And so the people had some stuff. I think we had, whatever we had, you know, that was ours, we kind of were holding. And then the next house we found was, we rented half of a duplex right on McClendon. It was a half of a duplex, and we often, when somebody had moved out on the duplex side that was rentable, we would try to get a lesbian to move in there. So we almost always had like a lesbian who was a member who was living on that side, and then the other side was the Alpha House. So one apartment was the Alpha House, and I guess that by that point we had enough money to actually rent that half of a house.
Just
Alpha.
Just for Alpha. No one was living there. Okay.
And later on, people did live there. For instance, we started having Antioch college interns. They would live at the Alpha House. And again, when women came and visited, or when they came and moved and didn't have a place to live yet, we would sometimes let people stay at the house. So it wasn't but nobody was like renting there, or that was really their permanent, location.
Now, what were the Antioch college interns?
I never was part of that project, so I'm not a good person to give you the details. But obviously, somehow we must have put out information enough to other magazines that we exchange with, or that women in Antioch saw that Alpha wanted to have was open to having people do internships. If anyone had an internship in their college with a feminist organization or a lesbian organization, that would be something to get credit for. And so then we hooked up with Antioch, and I can't tell you more than that. I mean, clearly someone had to be the person who really made that connection, but I don't know how it happened. And then we had a series of women who, every quarter, semester, whatever it was, would come, and it would be part of their, they would get a little stipend, and they would do a project, whatever was at that time we want help with. Mm-hmm. And it depended on when it happened and what year it was. I don't even remember, I don't have good sense at all of what years that happened anymore.
Well, I see in your notes here about Alpha, you mentioned the Red Dyke Theater. What was that?
Oh, yeah, that was very early. The Red Dyke Theater and the Alpha Omegas were two early things that developed out of Alpha. Red Dyke Theater was a small group of Alpha women decided to do a theater company. There was a theater group before, Women's Song Theater, that had existed before Alpha formed. It was a feminist theater, straight and gay women in it. Elaine KUB was one of the people in that organization. And they did skits and songs and humorous stuff around feminist themes, with feminist themes. And so Red Dyke Theater became the lesbian version of, let's do a small theater group. And we would have performances, and we'd have fundraisers based on that. And they did things they did lip syncing, which was, of course, a bar popularity. So they would give you an example, they would, Gladys Knight and the Pips. They would be Gladys Knight and the Pips, or Clits, or something. It was we would do a funny name based on, lesbian stuff. And they would be up there lip syncing to a Gladys Knight song. We had other people doing other people, like Al Queen, instead of Al Green, Al Queen. And then they did little skits. They would just create their own little skits to have certain characters in, and that they would create, usually they were funny stories that also made some political point about either queerness or being a woman or something like that. And a lot of those women actually ended up living in, not all of them, but living in one of these communal houses together called Tacky Towers. That was, everybody named their house something, like Buttermilk Bottoms and Tacky Towers. And
where was Tacky Towers?
On Page Avenue. You know where Page Avenue is in Candler Park?
Yes. So where would these Red Dyke Theater performances happen? Would they be in bars or
anywhere we could find a space? MCC had they were in the theater on Highland, the North Highland at that point. MCC was the old theater. That was where their location was. We would perform there. Sometimes they would perform at the little Five Points Pub, or there was some other community center. I don't know if that existed yet, but places, little Five Points that had space that has that stage, I remember, did they ever perform at the Alpha House? I'm not sure if that was too much of a closed space. So trying to find a space that was big enough where people could come.
How long did the Red Dyke Theater was around?
I really don't remember that either. I really don't. Maybe a couple of years. That's my guess.
Would you get good crowds?
Oh yeah. Yeah, now that became a very popular thing. All kinds of people would come, to see it. Yeah, people that were not in Alpha, that were not were not out, they would find that about. A lot of times the way you get information out beside the newsletter, because you only had certain people on the newsletter, that would get passed around, by the way. Newsletter would get passed from person to person. So it got to more women than just the number of people we mailed to. But also, early on, there was no internet. There was, so it would be like going to bars and handing out a leaflet. Just leafleting, handing out information that way, putting leaflets at a bar, putting leaflets at another event that would happen, that we know there were going to be gay people at,
So we're getting sort of toward the end of today, but one thing I did want to, and we can pick up on this in the next interview, is you did mention the Alpha Omegas, and I know that was a big part of Alpha. So if we could talk just a little bit about that.
Yeah, and
to
that
wrap
happened
things up
in
today.
I think it was '74 before we had the Omegas. So the idea was that.
And tell people what the Omegas were.
Okay, yeah, Alpha was a political and social and educational kind of organization. So socially, a lot of the things were just so people get to know each other and do things together. And one of the things that developed is some of the jocks type people would like to go out and do touch football or play basketball or do some kind of sport thing. And we would have different places. There was Candler Park, there was Iverson Park, there was the place behind Maryland School, there was a field over there. So we'd go someplace on the weekends and play something like that. And then so someone had the idea of, why don't we have a regular softball team? Some people bought some softball stuff and we would play. We wouldn't have enough people sometimes to really play a game. So why don't we do a team? So we talked about it, and the idea was we're going to be a team. We need to be a feminist team, and we need to make sure that everybody can join. You don't have to be a jock. You don't have to have played softball before. So that was our basis, that anybody could join. We wanted everybody to join and learn to do that and have fun. And we had two women who had coached softball before and were softball jocks and softball players. So
you would hope so.
Amy Darden and Claudette Hopkins, which I'll take her name out of this for sure, but they were our coaches for the original Alpha Omegas. And Alpha Omega, because it's Greek, we thought that sounded great, beginning and end, Alpha Omega. And Alpha was ALFA, so it wasn't spelled out, but if anyone wanted to know who we were, we would tell them. And if we wanted to be funny and someone asked us that we didn't think needed to know, we would say with the Atlanta Light Fixtures Association.
So what league would you play in? What
It was a city league. It was the Atlanta City League, and they had different levels, and we were beginning teams, so we were being a beginning level.
And was it only women you would play
against? Yes, all women. And they were all women. It's an all-women's league, and there were a lot of other teams that had a lot of lesbians on them. It was clear to us, and we knew that. But nobody was out. And sometimes we'd play a team which we think almost all the women seemed to be dykes on that team, and we would have a lot of fun because, there they were, like, trying to be very in the closet. There we were shouting things like, "Give me a D, give me a Y, go on. Give me a K, dyke."
Did you ever have women from the other teams approach you after games to ask questions or to seek out information on your organization?
I don't remember that. I think it would have to have been off the field, way away from, if that happened. Although other people might have had that experience. More like we, became friends with some of the people. And it's kind of like, what it was? So much is don't ask, don't tell kind of feeling about families, about churches, about schools, about work, about life. So it was like that in this league. People would clearly know who we were, identify and want and like us and be friends, but nobody would come and say, "So, what about this lesbian organization?" And so if I'm a lesbian, nothing like that.
Did you have a sense that some of the other teams knew that you were?
Oh yeah.
lesbian?
Oh no. Well, they have to know. After our fans would come and we would do all these cheers, which would be about being dykes and
Do you have any memories of any negative interactions at any of these games or any homophobic?
You know what? This is another over-the-head thing. I didn't, probably because I was having so much fun and I was such like coming out in this kind of a setting that I did. I never felt like, oh my God, I'm queer. Oh my God, it's terrible. Oh my God. I never had those feelings. It was all a very positive, like, this is great to be who you are. If you're gay, that's great. You're a lesbian, that's wonderful. In fact, being a lesbian is a wonderful way to be. It's all that kind of positive feeling, and all I remember is the positive stuff and the support. And I'm not saying that there weren't people in the fans of the teams who might have said comments, but probably I was just totally ignoring it, or who cared, or so I don't have that kind of sense of that, like, oh, we had we were really scared sometimes because all these people and these men came, and I don't remember any of that stuff.
Where would the
being
games
true.
happen as part of this league?
They would. They
around-
had particular fields all over that
All over
you'd
the
go
city.
around to, and so I don't remember more specifically than that.
Okay. So it wasn't one location each time.
I can't remember. Do they have one place where we played every game? I really don't. I'm honestly not remembering. I don't think that was true, but I know that they do sometimes. Later on, I knew that there were leagues that had. This was the complex they played at all
Right,
the time.
right.
But I don't remember that being true, and I don't
I
know
just-
if that's a mistake of my memory or.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, we've just done it 2 hours, and we've gotten
Okay.
through the mid-70s, so we'll
Well,
pick
thank
up
you,
with
thank you.
the second half next time.